Welcome back to episode 2 of VECTRA's podcast series with Holger Hembach. In the last episode, we discussed how human rights violations and weak due diligence practices can expose companies. In this episode, we'll shift gears from reputational damage to legal liabilities. We'll discuss how companies can face legal actions due to human rights violations, explore high-profile cases, and learn strategies to mitigate legal risks in an increasingly regulated landscape. Welcome back, Holger. Shall we start?
Thank you. Yes, please.
In the last episode, we discussed how non-compliance can impact the brand's image and consumer trust. But what are the key legal liabilities companies face for human rights violations, and how severe can the penalties be?
It depends on the legal framework of the country in question. For example, in Germany, we have the Due Diligence Supply Chain Act, and it is enforced by a dedicated authority, the German Federal Office for Export Controls, and that office can impose fines. So in Germany, enforcement is very much driven by fines which may be imposed by the relevant authorities. In France, this French due diligence law, you don't have this possibility of fines. So enforcement is very much driven by civil proceedings. Under French law, companies, NGOs may put companies on notice and tell them you're not complying fully with your obligations under this law, and they may ultimately sue them. So in France, that's very much driven by NGOs suing companies. In the US, you have the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act. In the United States, it's forbidden to import goods which are wholly or partially made using forced labor. And the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act establishes a rebuttable presumption that goods from a certain area or made by certain companies are made with forced labor, with the consequence that these goods must not be imported into the US. So you had many cases where goods worth millions of dollars were stuck in US Customs because US Customs had a suspicion that they were made with forced labor. That's not technically a penalty, but it has severe consequences for companies which engage in that. And under the upcoming forced labor regulation in the EU, you will have a similar situation that goods which are made with forced labor must not be offered within the EU. So that's also a way of enforcing those laws.
Indeed. So a lot of different regulations in different countries.
Yes, correct. Yes.
Have there been any notable cases of companies facing legal actions due to human rights violations in their supply chains?
There are plenty of cases internationally because there's a sort of trend, or since several years, various actors, including NGOs, are trying to hold companies liable for human rights violations. There has been a large lawsuit in Canada against Loblaw. Loblaw is a large Canadian retailer, and they try to establish a responsibility for the crash of the factory Rana Plaza. And they basically said, the plaintiffs basically said, Loblaw has always said, we have all those human rights policies in place, and we have all those corporate social responsibility actions. And by that, they have portrayed themselves as a very responsible company, but they have not lived up to that. And by that, they wanted to construe some kind of responsibility of Loblaw. That was rejected, but still the company was exposed to that risk. In the UK, there's litigation ongoing right now regarding human rights violations by Shell, regarding oil spills in the Niger Delta in Nigeria, and citizens of Nigeria trying to hold Shell responsible for that. There has been plenty of litigation in the United States. In the United States, there's a law called the Alien Tort Statute, and people were trying to use that in order to hold companies responsible for human rights violation which had been committed abroad. The Supreme Court has severely limited the possibility to use that law, but there is still some room to wiggle and still used, and NGOs also trying to find other ways or other avenues to hold companies responsible. And in Germany, there was litigation against a textile retailer regarding the crash of a company and the burning down of a company in Pakistan. This also led to no avail, basically, because the statute of limitation applied. But this also is another example of affected persons trying to hold companies liable. And so there's plenty of litigation going on around the world in which affected persons trying to hold companies liable.
Yeah. So it's not just companies risk penalties from governments, they also risk legal actions from third parties.
Yes, definitely.
With so many updates in global laws that tackle human rights violations, how do the liability laws compare internationally?
The landscape in that regard is very diverse. There are human rights obligations for companies which basically do not entail any kind of liability, and there are laws which are very strict. There are laws which are basically limited to obliging companies to lay open certain information, but there are no real consequences if they don't. The UK's Modern Slavery Act would be an example, the Australian Modern Slavery Act, also the law against child labor and forced labor in Canada. And there are other laws which foresee liability for companies and which may foresee penalties. There are severe penalties foreseen under the CSDDD, as is now. Obviously, it's still being discussed, so nobody is going to know what the final version is going to look like. Right now, the CSDDD foresees severe liability, severe penalties for violations of human rights obligations.
So many different and diverse legal frameworks around the world with different.
Right, exactly.
Are there differences in how liability is enforced in Germany versus other jurisdictions, and what lessons can companies learn from these legal frameworks?
I think a specific feature of the enforcement in Germany so far is the strong focus on enforcement by an authority. As I mentioned, there is an authority which is in charge of enforcing the German due diligence supply chain law, and many people who think that companies violate their obligations under law turn to that authority. So enforcement is a lot about informing that authority and expecting it to act upon it. And in other countries, you do not necessarily have authorities with such a strong role in enforcing, and then people try to find other ways. I mentioned France, where NGOs have resorted to putting companies in notice and suing them later on. And apart from the human rights laws the laws imposing human rights obligations of companies in the strict sense, there are also a lot of attempts to use classic civil liability mechanisms in order to hold companies liable. Basically, you are liable, civilly liable, if you have damaged somebody, or if harm can be attributed to you and you've violated a duty and caused that harm negligently. And so many people try to find ways to use classic, normal civil laws in order to hold companies liable for human rights violations, even outside of the framework of formal human rights obligations imposed by specific laws.
What are the most critical steps a company should take to protect itself from liability risks related to human rights violations?
I think it's important not to look that much at the law. So the experience with many laws which impose human rights obligations shows that companies look at the law, they see what do we have to do and try to fulfill all requirements of the law. But the more laws you have internationally, the more difficult it is to keep all those laws in mind and to have an overview what exactly you have to do under all of these laws. So in my opinion, the solution is not to focus on the law. What does that law tell me to do? Because basically they all go back to UN guiding principles on business and human rights. And I think companies are well advised just to try to implement UN guiding principles on business and human rights as good as they can. And then they will be fine regarding the requirements of all kinds of laws which may be passed internationally. And they don't have to focus that much on studying the law. What exactly does it say? Then they will be able to say confidently, we fulfilled the obligations. There may be some formalities they still have to meet regarding reporting. They have to take care of that. But in substance, they are fine if they really try to implement UN guiding principles.
So basically, they just really need to do the right thing vis-a-vis human rights. And,
exactly.
And they should meet the law.
Not tick the box, but do the right thing. That's it.
Exactly. Yeah. Thank you. That wraps up episode 2 of our insightful series with Holger Hembach. It's clear that companies can reduce their legal exposure by strengthening their due diligence processes and implementing robust compliance mechanisms. The real question is, who can support these companies? And the simple answer is VECTRA International and its team of global experts. So if you would like more information, please do reach out. If you found this series helpful, please don't forget to subscribe and share it with your network. We're doing a podcast every month with an industry expert for more expert insights and practical strategies related to supply chain risks. So see you in the next one. Take care and bye-bye.